My name's Kevin Rooney. I'm a teacher and a writer, and if I'm being pretentious, I might even say an author. This debate called Schools and Social Mobility, a Grammatical Error. I have to be honest with you, I've had a bee in my bonnet for a couple of years, and it's about this particular issue, about the fact that more and more people seem to assume that education in schools is about preparing a young person for a job. And I notice a couple of my students from the school I teach in Bushy in Hertfordshire over on the left, and yesterday lunchtime we had a big debate in my school because the new head teacher wants to introduce business style suits for the sixth form, and the sixth form don't like it, so we invited the head to debate a couple of the sixth formers, and it was mobbed with about 350 people squashed in, and literally 100 or 200 students locked out from the debate. But what was interesting was, in the cut and thrust of the debate from the floor, the first two teachers to speak, who were speaking against the students, and the teachers were arguing in favour of suits, they both made the point in passing that our job is to prepare you for a job, and wearing suits is part of that process. And it went on commented upon the fact that these teachers both thought that our job as teachers is to prepare people for a job. So I'm curious to have this debate out. Now obviously I put my cards on the table as to why I want to have this debate, but I'm going to be an impeccably neutral and impartial chair. And I honestly will give as much time as people want on the panel, and especially from the floor, to absolutely say, Kevin, you're a dreamer, wake up, smell the coffee, the world's moved on, and just get with it and stop being so idealist and utopian and stupid. So that's the background to the debate. We've got four brilliant speakers, and each speaker is going to speak for 5 minutes, throw out their key points, and then after that I might ask them a wee question or two, or we might actually go straight out to you, the floor, we'll involve you, and we'll get into good old ding-dong, a good cut and thrust of a debate and questions, and we'll see where it takes us. We'll probably resolve nothing, but it's good to talk and it's good to explore this. Now, we got four speakers, and the first speaker, James on my left, is the author of The Myth of Meritocracy, and he's a columnist for International Business Times. It's a great wee book that he's written. I read it just a week or two back, and it's brilliant. And on my right, going second, immediate right, is Pamela Dow. Pamela is a person I've really only met about 2 years ago, and I've got massive respect for her, and I'm really glad to call her a friend now. She's Director of Development at Prison Reform in HMP Wandsworth, and she's founder of the Beauvoir debates. And as she speaks, you'll probably find that she's extremely knowledgeable about this discussion and the education debate more broadly, and it'll probably come out during the cut and thrust of the discussion, I suspect, without giving too much away. Speaking third for 5 minutes on my extreme right is Terry James. And Terry James was the boss. He was my boss. He was my head teacher of my high school, Queen's School. And he left in the summer to become a consultant and make lots more money. And an education consultant, and tell schools how to operate. I've always wondered about why we need education consultants, but maybe that might come out. Terry's a great fella. Terry's on the floor because when he came to our school 16 years ago, I've been at my school 20 years, I'll never ever forget. I'm going to really shame you and embarrass you. Not shame you, because you won't be ashamed of it. In his first assembly, he turned around and he said his hero was Ken Livingstone. That was back 16 years ago. And he says, I believe that education in schools is about social justice. So it's going to be great to hear from him. On my immediate left, if you know anything about the Battle of Ideas, you probably recognise Frank Ferretti. Frank, it's brilliant to have Frank. Frank wrote a book, which is a few years ago now, called Wasted, Why Education Isn't Educating. And I still love that book, and I still go back to that book and look up pages in it to remember little points when I'm arguing with people about education. And his very latest book is What's Happened to the University, ? And before that, his book was The Power of Reading, From Socrates to Twitter. So that's the plan of action, guys. And I think, without further ado, James, we'll go straight into your 5 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. Social mobility. Social mobility seems to, and meritocracy is the word that's also used. It's come back onto the agenda recently for a number of reasons. One of those, I think, is that most of us kind of get a feeling that, you know, if you're born into a poor home, or you're born to poor parents, your chances of of getting on in the world are far less than if you're born into a privileged home. I think that's fairly widely accepted. Particularly in Britain, this seems to be true. So the statistics we have tend to back this up. So according to the OECD, Britain has some of the lowest rates of social mobility in the developed world. In the UK, a children's earnings when they grow older are more likely to reflect their fathers than in any other developed country. And I think there seems to be a broad recognition about this right across the political spectrum. The authors of an intergenerational mobility study have kind of painted this picture. This quite famous study which looked at different cohorts, different birth cohorts, and found that since the late 1970s, there's been a sharp decline in Britain in social mobility, and it can only partly be explained by the education system. A big part of the problem seems to begin before children even put on their first school uniform. So according to the Sutton Trust, children from the poorest fifth of families are almost a year behind middle-income families in scores on vocabulary tests by the time they are 5. Education, though, the school system is obviously hugely important, and we're here to talk about that to some extent today. Those with a low level of educational attainment are up to 5 times more likely to be living in poverty than those who received a good education. Another interesting thing related to this debate is what's happened to university education in recent years. So in the last decade or so, the number of working class children going to university has increased quite dramatically. But the proportion of working class children attending a Russell Group university, one of the kind of top so-called red brick universities, has actually fallen. It's against this backdrop that Theresa May and others are proposing that grammar schools be brought back as the kind of answer to kind of improving Britain's social mobility, and it's kind of related to this so-called golden age of social mobility, which many think we had in Britain after the Second World War. Aside from, I'm opposed to grammar schools because I think aside from the problem with compartmentalising children at age 11, I don't think grammar schools actually work on their own terms. So I don't think they do improve the prospects of bright but poor children. So I think there's evidence from the grammar schools which exist in this country, which still exist at the moment. So in the 36 local authorities where selection at 11s does still exist, poorer children do worse than in comprehensive areas in terms of educational outcomes. Buckinghamshire still has a selective system, for example, and private school pupils there are 2.5 times more likely to pass the 11 plus, whereas the pass rate for children on free school meals is 1/8 of the average. Areas that have retained selection also have a bigger wage gap between high and low earners. The highest earners from grammar areas are better off than the highest earners from grammar areas are better off than top earners born in comparable comprehensive areas. And just 3% of those attending existing grammars are entitled to free school meals, while 13% of those pupils come from the independent sector. So what I do think grammar schools do is kind of soup up education for the small percentage of people while damaging it for the rest. I think that's a morally suspect concept anyway, but I don't think it's beneficial to the economy. When a large proportion of the jobs today are middle-class, white-collar jobs. We no longer live in a world where the great mass of people can be consigned to jobs as kind of factory hands. We need an educated population right across the board. As someone from the left, I also feel slightly uneasy when social mobility is posited as a kind of cure-all, with the unspoken assumption that the good society is about plucking 1 or 2 bright kids from the mass while everyone else goes off to toil away in a Sports Direct or Amazon warehouse. The other thing I think we lose with grammar schools particularly is the idea of lifelong education and self-improvement. So I don't think we ought to be giving kids at age 11 the message that education isn't for you. It may be slightly utopian, but I actually think education is for everyone, and that it's a lifelong process. So I think even the left even my political kind of friends on the left have forgotten this to some extent. So in the past, you used to have a big thing on the left around workers' self-education. So you could do your job down the pit or on the production line, and the local working men's club would offer various types of self-improvement classes, so you could go on learning about the world aside from your work. My own granddad, for example, was from a mining family in South Wales, and he was at the same time one of the most educated people I ever met, because he educated himself through the workers' movement at the same time. I don't think that really exists anymore. I think just finally, I think there's a problem with social mobility to some degree with generational expectations. So working class parents don't necessarily value education because when they were growing up, you could easily leave school without qualifications and walk into a job in industry. So I think to some extent they think that that will be the same for their own children, but today the jobs market is much more professionalised. So often you need a degree for even something that's minimum wage. Yeah, that's kind of me, and I think that's my time.
Brilliant. Pamela, on you go.
Thank you. Before I start, a disclaimer, I am a Whitehall public servant. My salary is paid by your taxes. I don't work in education policy now, but I did for many, many years, and I feel very strongly that every democratically elected government is supported by good public servants, giving objective, impartial advice. So the case I want to make today tries to avoid ideology, big P political partisan positions completely. I'm going to question whether schools could or can promote social mobility and what that looks like specifically and technocratically in practice. And having argued that social mobility is just too ill-defined a thing to have schools promote, I hope it will be clear that we should not make them. Delivering public services is hard. It's really grindingly dull and hard. What Marx Weber said of politics is much more accurately applied to public policy. He said something like the strong and slow boring of hard boards. There are never enough, there will never be enough resources. Demand will always exceed supply. Any change in rhetoric, any unforeseen event can create all kind of mad, perverse incentives and counterproductive changes in behaviour. Any change, financial, structural, ideological, takes ages to penetrate to the front line. There are 24,000 schools in England, 24,000, 500,000 teachers, about 8 million pupils. I don't know what you all do as day jobs, but I hazard a guess that at some point in your lives you've tried to get a load of people to do something towards a shared goal. It's hard. So when trying to implement something, you need to be damn sure that you can tell everyone what it is, explain how to do it, and persuade them why they should change their behaviour to do it. Woolly, subjective, complicated, nuanced policy goals will fail. They do fail, over and over again. There is no more woolly goal than social mobility. So what are we talking about? What are we talking about when we use the phrase social mobility? Quick aside, in about 2008, the Department for Education did some public research into the label social mobility and discovered that the majority of people thought it referred to wheelchair access in town centres. What do we mean? That's a fact. What do we mean in a way that can be clearly defined and crucially measured in simple public policy impact terms, in a way that doesn't nudge people to behave oddly or game or create perverse incentives? Who should we hold accountable for this? Social mobility. Do we mean more people end up doing better than their parents? Better how? Salary? What if you end up earning less than your Catford parents, but you live in Carlisle in a nice big house with a big garden and a nice car? How do we factor in single incomes and dual income families? Do we try for a quality of life measure? So if you rent your house but can afford to send your kids to a private school, have you been more socially mobile than someone paying down a mortgage who can't? How are we defining a good life? There's an old question. The most common definition is, of course, around this pleasingly scientific-sounding term socioeconomic status, linked to level of education and access and progression to professional careers. Follow that through, though, from my perspective of implementing and measuring it. Are we going to penalise schools if the child of journalists or academics or lawyers flunks their exams and becomes a self-employed coder or a singer or a gym instructor? The extent to which the relationship between education and income is a causal one is very complicated. It's contested and dynamic. Of course money matters, but so does parental education, motivation, culture, experiences. So here's my proposition. Let's pretend we are not talking about a Whitehall department implementing a workable public policy agenda across 24,000 schools. Let's just agree we're talking about getting the kids of parents who don't work or who do unskilled work into skilled work, or at least give them the aspiration and choice to do so if they want to be the authors of their own life stories. Because happily, as a society, we know how to do that. We can avoid my definition of measurement problem. All history and international evidence points to the same solution. The simple way a society gives all its kids more choice, aspiration, access is educating them as early as possible, as well as possible. helping them to read and write so they can learn on their own, exposing them to the best that has been thought and written, giving them cultural literacy so they can engage with society around them, inspiring them in science, in stories, in mathematics, in languages, in music and art, in drama, in engineering, and then letting them choose and write their own life stories. That's what grammar schools do, that's what King Solomon's Academy does, that's what Mossbourne Academy does, that's what countless schools with an intake of people from the lowest socioeconomic groups do. In conclusion, if we decide that schools have to promote social mobility and hold them accountable for it, rather than saying they just have to teach kids how to read and write and learn stuff, we will reverse social mobility, because the kids who most rely on learning stuff at school rather than at home are the poorest ones. Have I got time for a cautionary tale?
Go on.
Cautionary tale, the Troubled Families Programme. The Troubled Families Programme. Of course the evaluation showed it had no impact. Its goal, its specific goal, was turning families around. An endlessly interpretable smorgasbord of society's most complex issues in one phrase: unemployment, truancy, housing, violence, drug rehab. This funding stream, because that's all it was, actively encouraged local authorities and private companies to rebadge existing initiatives, to target easy wins, to move funds away from prevention. And actually, there are some lovely examples of great things going on under the Troubled Families umbrella at a micro-local level. Wandsworth has a great key worker scheme that picks up kids and gets them into school. But the key thing is that what they said was, we want to reduce truancy. And then they said, why are the kids truant? Because mum's drunk at 8 a.m. Why is mum drunk at 8 a.m? She doesn't have any reason not to be. Okay, let's get mum sober, find her a job, help her stick to it. And while we're doing that, we'll send someone around to take the kids to school at 8 a.m. The common thread of success in all the stories is humane and compassionate frontline public servants given resource and freedom to do sensible things to solve problems. The common thread of failure is compliant, automaton, budget maximising, meeting nationally set targets, rebranding what's done and how, with the core objective of getting central grant funding from the Troubled Families Programme. A very similar version of this tale may one day be told about the people premium, but it'll have to be when I work in the private sector.
As Pamela has just said, terms like social mobility, social justice, meritocracy are terms that can mean different things to different people. They're often confused, and therefore I think to some extent you need to try and put that to one side, because I don't think you can say we're not going to deal with an issue because we can't define it, or we can't find an easy phrase that sums it up to everybody's satisfaction. And that's not to say that these terms are sometimes being used in such a way as that they actually cause more confusion than they do clarification. In his 1958 book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, Michael Young uses the term as a warning rather than aspiration. And Young asserted that society based on a narrow definition of merit would be a terrible place to live. Such a meritocracy, he argued, would descend into disorder as sheep and goats began to fight each other. Indeed, it could be argued social mobility could imply a sort of really unhealthy competitive society after all. If some people are to rise, don't some, at least the same number, need to have to fall. So it depends how you're using this term. And in fact, when it came to the case against grammar schools in the 1960s, some of their biggest critics were middle-class parents who feared that their children might not get into the local grammar school with their place taken by someone off the local council estate. In fact, that, however, was always somewhat illusory fear, but illusory fears still grow large in the minds of those who are the victim of them, because the reality, as today's statistics are remarkably similar to what it was in the 60s. But in the sort of heyday of the grammar schools, if you like, only about 3% of students, actually, or pupils as they probably were referred to in those days, came from what would be regarded as the sort of traditional working class. Out of those who gained A-levels, only 1% came from the working class. Indeed, I still remember, I declared myself as a former grammar school boy, at my grammar school in the 1960s, I was the only person in my form whose parents lived in a council house. And when we became a little bit more politically aware and politically conscious, the 1970 general election, I similarly remember that my parents were the only ones that were going to vote Labour. It made it very easy for me to stand as the Labour candidate in the school election. There were, however, enough exceptions to the general rule whereby former grammar school pupils rose to positions of prominence, and that was enough in some respects to frighten the horses. I'm not talking about me in terms of rising to prominence, where I was part of the 1%. Social mobility, such as it was in the post-war years, resulted more than anything from economic growth, with a little help from the Attlee government. Put bluntly, there was more room at the top, and it may have coincided with the heyday of grammar schools, but it was not caused by that. Few would argue, however, against a weaker version of meritocracy, in which talent and effort are rewarded to a greater extent than the opposites. And for me, I would go with that. It may not be scientific, it may not be easily measurable, but there again, as someone once said, should we only value that which we can easily measure? But what's that got to do with grammar schools then? And as I say, the current stats mirror the position of the 1960s. The school average, and James has said something very similar to this, for children on free school meals is 18%. Depends whether you include private schools in that or not. Only about 3% of current grammar school students are in receipt of free school meals, and it's that 3% figure again. As Michael Wilshaw recently said, and I'm amazed to find myself quoting him in defence of any argument, grammar schools are stuffed full of the middle classes. A very persuasive argument that grammar schools don't promote social mobility can be seen from the fact that when Jeremy Corbyn, on one of the few occasions that he's got the better of Theresa May at PMQs, asked her what evidence there was for the expansion of grammar schools, she was unable to give him any. The best that she could do was to say that her new grammar schools would benefit relatively poorer children, but she couldn't find any qualified authority to support her. The evidence in grammar schools in selective authorities from a number of studies seems pretty clear. The education advantage received by those selected for the grammar schools, i.e. they're better than average exam performance, is more than outweighed by the performance of children in secondary modern schools who perform disproportionately badly. And it's interesting that those in favour of grammar schools call for their reintroduction, but no reference to the reintroduction of secondary moderns. And the idea that in any local area grammar schools can coexist behind comprehensives is a misnomer. In a given area, there will be typically one grammar school for 3 secondary moderns, with between 20 and 25% of the children going to the grammar school. Michael Young put the politics of grammar schools nicely, saying that every selection of one is the rejection of the many. Well, 3 or 4 actually. Meritocracy of this sort has the unfortunate effect of making aspiration into a zero-sum game. I've only got 1 minute left, so I'm going to summarise and then perhaps come back. Educated parents. This is more about parents than schools, I would say. And the main aspiration to try and improve social mobility must focus on the family. And while, as the Troubled Families programme illustrates, that's not an easy thing to do, there is plenty of evidence from things like children's centres and Short Starts that actually you can make a difference by focusing on things such as the well-being of mothers, maternal health, domestic violence, the home environment. Coming back to where Kevin started us, and I'm sure many of you will have read Kevin's article in yesterday's TES, and his students at Queen's, if they haven't done so, you better have done so by Monday, because otherwise you'll be in trouble.
Half-term break, they've got an extra week.
They've got an extra week to get in. But the idea that the role of education, even in the early years, should be about scholarship and intellectual development rather than social mobility, social justice, or the creation of meritocracy, whatever kind, for me, this is a false dichotomy, because the two aims are not mutually contradictory. Indeed, I will argue that they are complementary. Since when has a passion for learning, an inquiring mind, a thirst for knowledge, not been helpful in getting a good job? And I taught hundreds of children, and I know Kevin has as well, for whom this was the case. As I say, this isn't really about education, it is more about poverty, and Kevin's right in his article to that extent. It's more about poverty and child poverty in particular, and at best education, even in the early years, can only mitigate the impact of poverty. However, for me, while the challenge and the removal of poverty, sustainable economic growth and the fairer distribution of wealth remains a challenge, let's mitigate it the best we can.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not really sure why we're discussing the subject, because all the research that I've seen as a sociologist indicates that there is no causal connection between social mobility and education. And all the research that I've seen about attempts to somehow finesse social mobility, somehow increase it by these kind of projects and interventions, tend to be sort of without very much consequence. And usually when you look at the assessments that are made of all the, like Sure Start as an example, they usually say it's too early yet to be absolutely definite. But we feel in our heart of heart that something good was done. But usually nothing was done that actually materially changed the conditions that the people are under. And the reason for that is you can't turn troubled families around. I mean, troubled families have a complex set of relationships that are rooted in cultural and community dynamics. And you cannot simply have this formulaic approach and somehow imagine that, sort of through doing that, something very incredibly good is going to happen. And yes, in individual cases, you can see some positive development. I mean, just by the law of averages, there's going to be a few families that are going to be better off. But as a project, they've been singularly unsuccessful. If you don't believe me, look at the American experience, where they've been doing this for ever since the 1960s, since Johnson's Great Society projects, with singular lack of success. The poor remain poor, probably worse off now than they were. The rich remain rich, and nothing changes. So the point I want to emphasize is that education has got nothing to do with social mobility. It has a very important, tremendous importance with other things. The grammar school experience in the 50s and the 60s have been mentioned. And I was very, when I came to England from abroad, I was quite fascinated by that, because every English friend I had was the same person. They all came from working class backgrounds, and they all went to grammar school. So I said to myself, there was something interesting connection here. How did these children of coal miners and children of factory workers then go on to university and do so well? Maybe there's something really incredibly positive about grammar schools. What was really, and then I looked at it closer, and other people have looked at it closer, and it becomes very clear that social mobility in that period was not about the grammar schools, but was about higher levels of productivity, higher levels of profit rates, more resources, the state having more resources for expenditure on a variety of other schemes, which then meant that in most Western European countries, people were better off. As Macmillan said, we never had it so good, particularly him and his family. But in a sense, it kind of percolated, sort of pretty much at all levels of society. However, whether grammar schools are good or bad, have got to be evaluated on an educative sort of criterion rather than social mobility criterion. I'll come back to that in a second. So there's no connection. And one of the things I'm really worried about as a university teacher is that we now have half the kids go to university. And because universities are now charged with making kids, training them for jobs and doing all these wonderful socially driven kind of things, the quality of the education they're getting widening access. This is what we call widening access. But what they're getting access to is not what I got access to when I went to university. They're getting access to a piece of paper. And what we have is a kind of credentialism process occurring where people outwardly appear more educated, so everybody's going to university, and isn't that really kind of brilliant? Everyone's getting incredible paper qualifications about everything. But actually, at the end of the day, you'll find that the patterns of old, kind of repeat themselves. So I asked myself, well, yeah, but then not everybody stays where they are. Gaps are often overcome. There are groups of individuals who do really well. What's happening here? And if you look at different societies, you will find that the key variable in how people do in terms of becoming socially mobile is culture. The people that are able to move forward are the people that come from backgrounds where the parents or their communities are rule breakers. I'll give you an example. I live in a small town in Kent, where people were complaining about all these Polish people coming in, all these East Europeans. They don't speak English. This is going to put a tremendous burden on our schools. That was the stories that were going on. Come the first year results, all the Polish working class kids, their parents are picking fruit on the farms, are way ahead of the English kids. Way ahead. They might not speak the Queen's English, but for some miraculous, mysterious reasons, they're doing better than their English white working class equivalents. No secret, absolutely no secret. higher expectations. Right? These kids had much higher expectations. The parents had higher expectations. Their cultures had much higher expectations. Look at the United States, very similar pattern. Now, I had this story I tell people about the importance of culture. I was in Sydney, Australia, and I was talking to a headmaster, and I said, I was very interested in social mobility, and I said, look, what's going on? He said, you know, Frank, I can tell how children are going to do from the minute they come in there. And I thought it was really horrible. I mean, that is very fatalistic. So what do you mean? Well, I can tell by their cultural backgrounds. So what do you mean? Well, who do you think does the worst in our school? This is in Sydney, Australia. Which ethnic group does the worst in our school? Any idea, by the way, who does worse in the Sydney school? White working class boys. But which kind of white working class boys?
The ones that come from the UK.
Absolutely, yeah. English working class children of English migrants do worse. No, you know, whereas the Chinese and the Asians and everybody else, it's like a hierarchy. You can almost predict in advance how they're going to do. And of course, the reason for that is because when they go to school, they don't just go to school as individuals. They go to school, they become the personifications of a way of life, of expectations and rules. And those rules, those expectations can only be broken down through society, through people struggling within society itself to create a different kind of world where people are naturally having high expectations. Very dangerous game that we're playing here. I don't usually quote something, but there's something I read the other day by Bertrand Russell, the philosopher. He wrote this in 1948 when he gave his Reed lecture. He said, it's talking about education. There's a danger that means should be mistaken for ends, with the result that the ends are forgotten. It's a word about education, its purpose being forgotten. And it says, there's a risk that in the pursuit of equality, good things, which there is difficulty in distributing evenly, may not be admitted to be good. Some of the unjust societies of the past gave to a minority opportunities which, if we are not careful, the new society that we seek to build may give to no one. And I think it's really right. What it's basically saying is that education is not like money that you can redistribute. It's a qualitative resource. It's, for lack of a better word, intellectual and cultural capital. You can't just simply say, you know, I'll take it away from the grammar school people in Kent and give it to the comprehensive. Because, if every grammar school was closed down, nothing would change in the comprehensive. If every private school, every independent school was shut down, as some people want, the rest of the education there wouldn't be any difference whatsoever. So it's very easy to think about how we redistribute education resources, but the minute we begin to go along that road, we do end up forgetting what education is really all about. And at the end of the day, the only way that we can do anything good is by being good educators, where we can influence individuals, we can influence small groups of people. We can even go outside. I mean, I used to do what you were talking about. I used to teach Kent minors in the Workers' Educational Authority. And every Thursday night, they would show up from the pits in suits and ties. And they would hassle me, give me more books. Why did they have this aspiration to read after work, after a hardship down at the mines? The reason why is because of expectations that they had of themselves. And I think that's what we lost over the last 30 or 40 years in England. That expectation that we had of working class people in particular has just been completely pulverized. And the key challenge for us is how we kind of recreate that through intellectual and educational interventions, not in the family, but in the schools.
So things I picked up in education has nothing to do with social mobility. There's a problem with credentialism and the culture of certification. The real debate should be about the culture of low expectations or high expectations. Education is a qualitative resource. A lot of people want to talk about the grammar schools. Personally, I want to ask, is the grammar schools debate a distraction from this conversation? I'd be interested to see what people think. And I just really want people to come back square on. To what extent should the aim of a school be to help disadvantaged kids, the people at the bottom of the ladder, up the ladder a bit? To what extent should a school be for that? Let's confront that head on. I came through King's Cross this morning and I couldn't get a tube to here, so I went out and got a taxi from King's Cross to the Barbican. Told the taxi man, I said, what's the story? I told him about this debate. And he went on relentlessly about his kids and how his kids chose their A-levels to do with what jobs it was going to get them, and how they all chose the sciences and stuff. And as it happens, we had our sixth form open evening, option evening last week, and speaking to a lot of parents, the parents didn't want their kids to do some of the humanities, they wanted them to do the sciences, all based on the fact that they're worried about their kids getting the best job possible. So that's what parents are saying, an awful lot of parents. Are they right to say that? Should we challenge them on that? What's the story? Does anybody want to pick up anything that I've said?
Well, I think on that, parents ought to be worried about their kids' jobs and their future. So I'm really concerned that my son wants to be a journalist. I would probably rather he kind of did STEM subjects and ended up, but as an educator, we have a very different kind of mission. As educators, we're there to educate. And we know that if we become too obsessed with social engineering concerns, then it will be at the expense of education. And the thing that I worry about is in England is every time there's a social problem, a politician says, we've got to put the internet, sexting on the curriculum, or we've got to put financial management on the curriculum, or sex education. It's like a long list of things. And the more things you put on the curriculum, the more we lose sight of good English, good history, good physics, and all the rest of that.
Brilliant, Frank.
Can I
James, go on, Terry.
Just quickly about the role of education in social mobility. It might sound strange for someone who taught for 38 years in a secondary school and was ahead for 22, but it's not secondary schools that can make a difference. I'd be the first to say that, whether grammar schools or any other secondary schools. I do feel, however, and I suppose to some extent, as we all tend to be, I'm influenced by my wife in this, because she's also a head teacher, but she's a head teacher in a nursery school, and she runs 3 children's centres. And I think that actually education, if you want to call it that, of very young children and with parents, and I have seen, and it's inevitably anecdotal, support that, say, given to parents and parents of very young children, if it's targeted in the right way, I think that can make a difference. I think that if you look at all the evidence, it shows that developmental measures by the age of 22 months impact on education, give you a guide to educational achievement at the age of 26 years. And I am, maybe naive enough, idealistic enough to feel that rather than sit back and do something, and I agree that it's probably more about economic issues than anything else, but that we should put much more money into there. There is some evidence that inevitably it does come back to money, and Frank was right, and other people have said about the fact you've got more money to invest in the system generally, rather than getting into zero-sum game. There is, interestingly, one example of where if you throw, surprise, surprise, huge amounts of money at it, that perhaps you can make a difference, and that's the London Challenge, with money that was given to secondary schools in some of the poorest London boroughs, the inner London boroughs, where education achievement was probably the worst in the country. Now, those boroughs are actually producing some of the best results that, of any inner city areas. Now, how impactful that will be in the longer term, we'll have to wait and see. It's a shame the plug was pulled into 210 anyway, so it probably won't be long lasting.
Dead on, Terry. Okay.
Can I make a quick point?
Yeah, and you go.
I think sometimes the kind of this, I think the dichotomy between kind of education and then like money and the economy, wider society. I think it's a false dichotomy to some extent. So I was recently spent about 6 weeks in a town called Rugeley in Staffordshire, and if you look at the way the economy's changed there over the past 40, 50 years, so 40 years ago they had a coal mine there which paid wages between £300 and £900 a week in today's money. You had Thorn EMI, which offered again a variety of fairly skilled jobs. You had a power station again where within all these workplaces there was a degree of social mobility. And if you look at what's replaced those companies in that economy, it's Amazon, Tesco and Argos. And for the most part this is 0-hour contract work. I mean, with Amazon you can only work there for 9 months, and then unless you're kind of exceptional you're kind of dismissed automatically. That place in terms of economic terms, there is more fear and insecurity there, it creates a culture of kind of fatalism. If you don't go off to university, there's less mobility within work, so you can't start on the factory floor and work your way up, because most of those companies which have replaced the old firms don't offer that to start with. So I think to say that I would object to saying it's just about kind of education or culture. I think there's an interplay between how the economics of this place has changed and why there's kind of a lack of mobility, because you can't progress up through these companies anymore.
Okay, Pam.
I think the point, we probably don't have time to get in today, but the point about the narrowing of subject choice at A-level and the misconception that you can only get a job in science and technology if you've got science A-levels is something important. And I think the answer is probably helping parents and pupils hear from people who work in Google DeepMind or wherever it is and talk about, you know, what inspired them at school. It's probably graphic novels more than physics GCSE. That's based on the 3 people I know doing those sorts of jobs. And on the London Challenge point, again, impartial. The success of London Challenge was school autonomy, quality of teaching, teach first with introduce at the same time, data transparency, higher standards of a core curriculum. Those 4 things are being replicated across the country. They are still being successful. It is not about a pocket of money. It's about a policy approach.
Just on your very last point, is Munira here, the former deputy mayor? No, because I'm going to say something which would really annoy her about London Challenge. Munira, I'm going to say something you could go back and see London Challenge. I don't think it's a big success that you're making it out to be. I think what's happened in a lot of London schools, they've got better at teaching the students to the test. They've got better at getting them to jump to the hoops. Now, whether or not you think that equates to success, we can have a debate. Munira's going to kill me at the back and come back on me on that, but we can have an argument about that. Right, get stuck in, disagreements.
I spent half a day in a magistrate's court the other day and I watched a woman being prosecuted for failing to take her child to school. He only had a 70% attendance rate. And what was interesting was that this was not the first or second time that she'd been in court, this was the 7th time. And on the previous 6 occasions she'd been punished by a conditional discharge. The point was this was all utterly pointless. And there was nothing that the magistrate could realistically do to this woman. And he made the sort of social mobility point to her. He said, look, your son deserves the same chance as everybody else. And what chance is he going to have in life if he only has a 70% attendance rate at school? Well, it seems to me this is social mobility in action. And it sums up in some ways the problematic approach of all our public policymakers these days, which is that they don't actually understand how society works. And they have no understanding at all about how individuals operate. Because I think Frank hit the nail on the head when he said it's all about culture. And if you are in a family that values education, can see the point of education, then the likelihood is that the child will do well. If you are, quote, from a troubled family, then it's unlikely that you're going to have those same opportunities. But that doesn't matter. Why don't we just leave those troubled families alone? The mum will be fine. Her child will be fine. It's almost like there's a lot of middle-class guilt about this, that we must do something to try and help. And it's all utterly pointless, because actually the resources would be much better spent rewarding success than throwing resources at people who are not in a position to make use of them.
Nice controversial point. I love it. I love it yourself. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to disagree, I'm afraid, because I don't think it's all about culture. I actually think it's much more to do with the economy. If you look at a time when social mobility was a reality in this country, I think a very, very narrow historical window, kind of look at the late 50s through to the early 70s, I think what lay behind that social mobility was far more to do with what was going on in the economy, what was going on in industry, new types of jobs being created. I think it had far more to do with that than what was going on in schools. Now, I wasn't alive at that time, but my guess is that during that period, people weren't getting obsessed with social mobility, and people weren't standing around talking about social mobility all the time. You know, this was just going on. Now, I kind of wonder why then we've all become so obsessed with social mobility. And I wonder whether it kind of takes responsibility away from, avoids this discussion about what's going on in the world of work. Why aren't new jobs being created? Why don't we have this economic dynamism that's creating these new jobs? And it shifts the focus away from what's going on in the economy and in industry onto individuals, but not in a helpful way where you're the creator of your own life story, but in a really negative way that you're the victim of the circumstances that you found yourself in if you don't have social mobility. One final point then, why has education become so obsessed with social mobility? I think it's because it hollowed out any other purpose first. It ditched knowledge, it ditched the classical curriculum, and then pushing social mobility on provides a useful thing to kind of fill that gap.
Thank you.
I actually think education is the strongest weapon we have for making people's lives better. My mum made it 25 years of her life was spent teaching kids in a comprehensive school that they, not only that they could do English literature, but that they could do anything they chose to do if they so decided to do it. And sometimes it didn't work, but sometimes it did. In the 25 years that my mum spent at that school, it went from being one of the worst schools in the county and producing some of the worst education results that the county saw, to being one of the top schools in the county and producing some of the best educated children from poor backgrounds.
That's brilliant.
Hello. I just wanted to make 2 points. One, that I was told by my head teacher when I was at primary school that I'd never get into the grammar school, and that left me with a huge chip on my shoulder. That's a slightly separate point, but I'm now an executive head teacher of 2 small village schools in Norfolk, and I have pupil premium money that I have to spend, and I have to show how I'm spending it, and I have to make sure that it goes to children who have at some stage at primary been on free school meals. So I'm choosing the way to spend it. I've got some children who are very able, and there is something that's come across my desk called Brilliant Club. It means that they get to go to Cambridge University to have a look around at the university, and then they get a PhD student in school taking them through a unit of work on a philosophy unit on what is fairness. And then they get to graduate. So it's a bit of a mock thing. I had a teacher, year 6 teacher, say to me, but I don't want them to do this because I've got to get them through their SATs. So they're going to miss maths, they're going to miss English. So that's one issue. I had a parent come in and say, why isn't my child being chosen for this? Because I took him to Cambridge last week and he's really interested in paleontology and he's really upset that he didn't get chosen. And I said, well, that's why he's not on my list.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You've all kind of touched on it, but I'd just really like to know your real opinion. It's the individualistic argument. Like, does the man make the clothes or do the clothes make the man?
One of the problems with engineering schools towards social mobility is that the mindset it puts kids in. You're told that you're not an adult because you're not 18 yet when you're in school, yet you have to decide exactly what type of adult you have to be before that. And it really takes away from the fact that you can't do multiple things and you're chosen to live this sort of, quite frankly, boring life. And you have to make your mind about it right now.
I'd like to be, I do recognise you, but I didn't catch your name, the chap next to Joe at the back. I'm conflicted, and maybe we should just stop spending money on Troubled Families programme. I'm kind of with you. These issues, we've been trying to solve them since the Enlightenment. But then I look around the 1,600 men in Wandsworth prison, and you know, with a few exceptions, their stories are all really similar. And every institution in their lives failed them, their family failed them, their school failed them. They've ended up in this last institution, which really isn't great. And it just makes me think: is some intervention that could have happened somewhere in their lives that would have meant that they're not locked up for 20 hours a day in their cell? So I don't know. I kind of want to carry on doing something, or at least trying.
Conflicted is okay. Yeah, Frank.
In terms of social policy, the one thing I really believe in is universal access to nursery care. I think Scandinavia is very good on that. It does make a huge difference to the lives of people, but not for educational purposes. It doesn't necessarily lead to more social mobility either, but it's something that's good in and of itself. It allows women to play a full role within society. It allows for high-quality childcare, and that's a really good thing. And probably more than any other single policy, that would also assist social mobility and ensure that the educational sort of terrain was more even. I disagree with Jo a little bit. Contrary to what she said, in the 1950s, people were obsessed about social mobility. every working class novel of the time is really about the single working class guy that somehow makes it to the top. And why is that? And the questions are always, you know, what's happening here? You're now having these working class lads and working class women, you know, who are moving out of their normal comfort zone, you know, and this is very strange. There's all these stories about how working class families are conflicted about allowing their kids to move away, you know, so, and that's a new development that is happening. Society isn't really understanding it, and the reason for that, it's neither culture or economic, it's both. Working class culture in the 1950s and 1960s is very different than working class culture today. And that was related to the economy, it was related to politics, a whole lot of different things. You know, today, I mean, I know I shouldn't be saying this, but there is no obvious working class culture that's clearly articulated. I think a lot of working class communities have become very disoriented. You go up to Doncaster, places like that, you feel like crying when you think of what those places used to be like 20 or 30 years ago. And they are, you know, physically working class people, but the community and the culture as well, I think that's one of the big challenges that we have, which isn't going to be sorted in schools.
And if you're working class and you want to challenge them, you can do that in a wee minute.
You can help me out there.
Just someone mentioned why we think there might be an obsession with education when we're talking about social mobility. I think it's partly to do with the way politics is more managerial now. So there's less ability to transform the economy, and to some extent less political willingness to do it. So in some of these kind of deprived communities or communities where you have a very precarious form of work nowadays, there's less political will or ability to actually change that. So instead it's about using the education system to help a few people escape from those communities essentially. And then on the other hand, one thing the Labour government did was to kind of tend to just give them money to kind of exist in this kind of to carry on existing in this kind of depressing environment, but they had a bit more money. I think that also relates to the way you see governments and kind of middle class progressives, if you like, don't tend to make arguments so much about work nowadays, but it tends to be, so the nanny state argument is about regulating what working class people can drink or what they can eat, instead of looking at some kind of the kind of economic situation which often drives people to overindulge in the first place. It tends to be just kind of looking at one end of that instead of looking at it at the kind of root of the problem.
Dead on, James.
Two very quick points, echoing what Frank said about universal nursery education. What people have mentioned about the classical curriculum, which I'm unashamedly in favour, and I think that between those things, and people have also talked about, I think there's a link here, the cultural deficit, for want of a better term, and that trying to close that gap. And I'm sure that this is a very difficult thing to do, but as I say, I feel extremely uncomfortable, and it may be my working class gone through now to middle class angst and my guilt and all the rest of it, but I just feel that we ought to be doing something, because as Frank says, I think there are some places that you can go to at the moment that are actually pretty depressing.
Lots of people are talking about social mobility. I'm probably more interested in what you think schools are for. Can I give Munira the right to reply? She was responsible for education in London under Boris Johnson. Go on, Munira.
I'm going to report Henry for bullying. Speaking, I wasn't going to. I wasn't actually involved in London Challenge. It stopped before I became involved in politics. It was established by the Labour government and then closed. And some aspects of it carried on, but some didn't. So it's not for me to defend it. I think it did do some good things. I think it created a structure and a sense of community amongst London teachers, particularly head teachers, and it channeled quite a lot of extra resource into London, which did make a very positive impact. And it also created a culture of high expectations. I think before London Challenge, a lot of head teachers thought they could get away with saying these kids won't do very well because of the backgrounds they're from. And after London Challenge, it was harder for them to do that. But I completely agree that the system overall, the macro policy of government, allowed many schools to gain the system, particularly the creation of equivalences at GCSE, which created this perverse incentive for teachers to give kids subjects that they thought would be easier, would do better for them in the league tables. And I think that what that points to is that high expectations are important, but even they are not enough. They were not enough in the London system, because actually education is not simply about self-belief and hoping that you will do well or believing in yourself in a kind of American way that we're used to, a sort of Oprah Winfrey kind of therapeutic way. It also requires education by experts. It needs teachers who know something about their subject and their subject knowledge. And that was the thing, I think, that was missing from the London Challenge and from a lot of education policy around that time. And some of the programmes that I was involved in developing at City Hall was about restoring a sense of trust with teachers and giving them access to networks where they could develop subject knowledge and they could meet with experts and do that without feeling that they were doing something bad or distracting from the classroom, that it was fundamental to them being successful. Sorry, just one final point. The thing that I observed in the 6 years that I was visiting London schools is that there are many head teachers, there are many teachers who I think really believe in what they're doing and do have a sense of moral mission. But I think education has become hijacked by a sense of morality and moral mission, and to some extent moral vanity. And the idea that education is not simply about giving individual people a chance to realise their own individual dreams, but it's simply about educating the next generation. We do need to educate the next generation of scientists and artists and engineers, and taking a more societal view of these matters, rather than thinking, how can we make ourselves feel better about the poor kid in inner city London? It's the wrong position to start from. And you have to be prepared then to take a much more rational view of education policy, which is not distracted every 5 minutes by how can we help this poor vulnerable person over here. I think that has a very distorting effect on education.
I have the double disadvantage of being brought up and educated in Doncaster and spent 20 years in Cannock as head, just next to Rugeley. Surely, I'm assuming I'm among friends here, but we know that grammar schools are irrelevant, but actually we know that education does marvellous things, but it can't result in social mobility. And at least we haven't been able to do it so far. And the worst thing we can do is expect it to get certain kids up to the level that they're doing high-tech jobs. Now what we're doing, I can see in Cannock and in Rugeley, we are demolishing the jobs for the people without good academic qualifications. And the worst thing that we can do in schools is to pretend we can turn every child into a university graduate for a high-tech job. What there is, the major fault at the moment is the mismatch, I say, between school and society and employment, because there will not be enough jobs for some of the kids who don't do well. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work hard with them, but it actually means that our politicians have been told by education, we can do everything, but we can't do everything. We can only do a limited amount. If we say we can do a limited amount, they'll say, oh, you're lefty teachers, you're getting excuses. No, it isn't. There are some educational difficulties that we cannot overcome, and we have to tell politicians this honestly.
Thank you very much. If you make social mobility the goal of education, then you think about what you need to achieve that goal and also what you don't need, and you tend to just kind of get rid of the stuff that you don't need. Trouble is, there's awful lot of stuff you don't need to get by in society, and my worry is that it's very reductive. A woman this morning talked about indulgent teaching of things you don't need to know. She called it indulgent, I call it civilised, because you learn knowledge, unnecessary knowledge. You might do nothing with it. It might just enrich your life, or you might end up doing something that completely surprises us all, and that creates the possibility of things like social mobility.
I would argue that education is almost irrelevant in the sense that what it should be is not preparing people for social mobility. That is maybe a consequence of a good education, but it boils down to knowledge for the sake of knowledge and a love of knowing things, not necessarily getting a good job or a good education.
Thank you.
I'd say, as a teacher, my job is to teach people that they learn more outside the classroom than they will in the classroom.
Yeah, I'd like to echo and build on the last couple of comments. I should probably add that I'm really lucky, in some respects, I work in the bubble. I work in one of the remaining grammar schools. And I have done for about 9 years now. I worked in several comprehensives before, particularly during the New Labour period. And one of the things that made me tear what's left of my hair out during that time was the complete sort of this insistence on worrying about policy initiatives, tinkering with this or that, rather than letting us get on and actually teach. And particularly in comprehensive schools where the pressures from the government were so big, what ended up happening was, as Kev was saying, teaching to the test, removing subjects that people might not do so well in, and actually the damage that that kind of politics has done by the New Labour curriculum which is probably sort of second only behind the number of people they killed around the world as the bloody crimes they committed. But actually, in terms of you know, the education for education's sake, why I'm so lucky to work in a grammar school, although in many ways I really don't like the concept, is I get to teach all day, and I get to teach to a really high level students who are really interested in knowledge, with teachers who are still experts, and it's an utter joy. And I really want to spread that to other people. I really wish the system would allow us to do that, and particularly government would allow us to do that.
Thank you.
Personally, when I was in primary school, there was a huge love of social mobility and really trying to get across to people that you have like this future, you can do it regardless of the fact that we were in a very, very poor area, and like everyone who went to that school definitely went to a housing association house, including myself. And for me, I loved knowledge and this kind of idea of just learning things for the hell of it. Like I used to just read up random things, and school became boring purely for the fact that all they were trying to teach was stuff on the curriculum, and also this idea that they were just sort of teaching you about how you can do better when you're older. I didn't need to know that. I already knew that. That was obvious. It's on the TV. Everyone knows how to do better. It was this idea, I wanted to learn random things that would help me in conversation, not that help me in life.
Thank you.
Okay, I think there's a difference between social mobility and social justice. Social mobility, I find, is just a way for middle-class, white-lefty people to make themselves feel better about people like me. But at the same time, we live in a capitalist society. We don't live in a free country or a very equal country either. And so we can't forget these things, because you don't leave class at the door, you don't leave race at the door, and you don't leave gender at the door when you enter school. So schools have to recognize this at the same time. And just related to that, I don't really like how this whole idea of the sake of knowledge for the sake of knowledge is exclusive to social justice. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge is a very radical concept in itself, and it should be related to social justice.
And who would like to go first? Who would
go first? Because I just want to endorse what most of the people have been saying there. I also prefer the term, as Kevin started off saying, social justice. I also believe, and it doesn't have to be the preserve of grammar schools, in the teaching of knowledge for its own sake, and getting expert teachers to teach what they, what they love, and instill that love of learning and love of knowledge. I think that is the most important thing. I happen to think that if you do that, it may well lead you to getting a better job, but you shouldn't have that functional approach from the start. But my experience is that, a lot of bad things were done by the, if you like, the New Labour functional curriculum. Some of us managed to resist that and managed to carry on teaching, if you like, a more classical curriculum. And you didn't have to be a grammar school in order to be able to do that.
Thanks, Terry. Who would like to pick up next? Go on, James.
I wanted to just echo a point that was made before. I don't think education can replace a kind of work or industrial strategy. If 50% of people go to university, you go down today to Swansea or Newport or something, and you'll find the call centres filled with people with degrees and mountains of debts doing jobs that education for its own sake is a good thing, but I don't think it's necessarily worth all of that debt they're accruing. I also think that's part of the problem is we see education, like university education, not going to university as a complete binary. So education's for you and it's not for you. Whereas in the past there was this idea of even if you didn't go away to university, even if you did an ordinary job, you could still go on learning throughout your life. There was still these kind of working men's clubs, workers' education associations where you could still better yourself, still educate yourself, but you didn't necessarily need a degree to do your job. So I think on the one hand it's clearly the economy. You have to kind of there's no point sending everyone away to university, then they go home and there are just no jobs for them to work in. But education should be not just for people who go away to university. It should be for something that goes on throughout your life and something you can still do, even if you do a supposedly boring job. You can still educate yourself.
Thanks, James. And go on, Frank.
I don't like the concept of social justice, but that's something I'm going to write about in my next book, so you can look at it next year. I think it's a completely irrational concept, doesn't mean anything. However, I would like to go back to grammar schools because I'm a big believer in the content of a grammar education. And a grammar education doesn't need to be institutionalized in a grammar school. You have to remember that the comprehensive ideal was about turning every school into a grammar school. That was the original argument. And what it did was it turned even grammar schools into comprehensive in many places. And it had the very opposite effect. And I think that what I would like to see is to give the grammar ideal far greater institutional backing within all the sectors. I would like to see comprehensives, sort of in many places adopting that kind of approach, because I think the focus and the emphasis that goes on there is really quite important, particularly important for working class people who need to have access to that. But I think there's one thing that we haven't talked about, which you're kind of alluding to, which is, the one area that almost never gets mentioned is the further education sector. And I think some of the colleges and the role that they have in tackling the problems to do with social mobility really need to be addressed. My wife happens to be a governor in one of the biggest sort of college of further education, and she's continually crying about the fact that they cannot get teachers to their school, period. And they have to employ, kind of literally anybody. Go to McDonald's, get a couple of people there, and that's it. So there's a problem there, that the area where we could be training people for jobs, it's not education, but about social mobility related thing, that's ignored as well. So at both ends, both the educational area and at the practical, instrumental area, we're both making big mistakes.
Thanks, Frank. And Pam?
We weren't going down this direction, but I'm sort of sad we've ended up there, because I feel like we should talk about it a bit longer. We don't have to make the choice between passing on the best that has been thought and written, using a classical curriculum that includes arts, vocational sciences, and the choice between that or trying to help poor kids be the author of their own life stories. The former helps the latter. And I did the chat there that got us into the conversation about, we're educating for the wrong jobs, or the jobs in the future aren't going to be the jobs that we're preparing people for. I agree, and there was a lovely taxonomy a while ago about the robots and what jobs are going to take over, and we'll try and get this right. So high cognitive, high routine jobs, surgeons, some aspects of the law, some transmitting of education, they're going to be gone. Robots are going to do those. Low cognitive, routine jobs, they're either already gone or they're going to go, the robots are going to get those too. The jobs that we are going to have to prepare ourselves for are the higher cognitive, non-routine jobs. So, teachers who support the needs of the child in front of them, whether it's primary or further education colleges. And then the lower cognitive, non-routine, the plumber that turns up at your house that just has to work out what's going on with your plumbing. And those two middle jobs, we can't predict them accurately, but we can know that if we pass on the best that has been thought and written, and we free up teachers in Tim's school and Kevin's school, take all the money away from the Troubled Families programme and put it into paying the best teachers in the world, will probably help social mobility as a happy outcome.
Give them all a round of applause.